There are moments in history when the destiny of empires depends not on armies or kings, but on a line drawn in the dust. In the burning plains of Mesopotamia, one such line was carved, a simple trench in the sun-baked earth that separated survival from annihilation. Beyond it, 50,000 Persian horsemen waited, eager to erase Rome from memory. Behind it, 25,000 weary Romans stood, praying that the ground beneath them would hold. It was the year 530 after Christ. The Roman Empire had long since lost its western heart, the eternal city devoured by barbarian tribes. Only the east remained, Constantinople, the world's last jewel, ruled by Emperor Justinian, a man possessed by an impossible dream, to restore the glory of fallen Rome. But before he could reclaim the west, he had to survive the east. For across the frontier, an ancient power stirred, the Sassanid Empire of Persia, led by the proud king of kings, Kavadai. The Persians were winning. Their armies had crushed Roman legions again and again. Roman morale was broken, their commanders predictable, their tactics relics of a bygone age. Desperation drove Justinian to take a gamble that bordered on madness. He entrusted the fate of the empire to a single man, young Flavius Belisarius, barely 25 years old. Not a seasoned general, but a member of the imperial guard, loyal, intelligent, and untested. Yet now he was made Magister Militum per Orientum, supreme commander of the eastern armies, with one order: march to the frontier fortress of Dara and stop the Persian tide. He was not expected to win, only to endure. Marching east, Belisarius found himself facing an enemy led by one of Persia's most feared minds, General Perozes, master of the immortal cavalry. To him, the Romans were decadent relics, hiding behind walls, incapable of meeting true warriors in the open. His army numbered 50,000, cataphracts clad in steel, the shock cavalry of the ancient world, men and horses armored like living fortresses. Against them stood Belisarius and his 25,000, a patchwork of Gothic mercenaries, Hunnic riders, and demoralized Roman recruits. It was not a battle. It was a sentence. But if the land offered no advantage, Belisarius would make one. At Dara, he studied the barren plain, a death trap for infantry. His officers begged him to withdraw behind the city walls. He refused. If he was to save the east, he would do it in the open, where courage was measured in dust and blood. He summoned his engineers, not to raise walls, but to dig. For days they labored under the merciless sun, carving trenches into the ground. Yet this was no mere line of defense. It was deception made flesh. Belisarius ordered a wide central gap left deliberately open, a wound in the earth that seemed to invite attack. To either side, he angled his trenches inward, forming the arms of a trap. At the ends of these arms, hidden from view, he stationed his deadliest troops, the mounted Hunnic archers. The plan was madness, to bait the Persians into striking where the line looked weakest, only to ensnare them in a funnel of death. It was a gamble worthy of myth. When the Persian host arrived, the horizon turned black with banners and dust. Perozes laughed when he saw the Roman defenses, a ditch, a child's trick. He sent a message dripping with arrogance. "Prepare my bath in Dara. I'll take it there after the battle." Belisarius replied with silence. The first day passed in tension. The Persians sent champions to duel, trying to break Roman morale. To their astonishment, the Romans won. Perozes fumed. At dawn the next day, the storm broke. His army advanced, the earth trembling under the hooves of tens of thousands. The first assault struck the Roman left flank with a rain of arrows that hammered shields like thunder. Men fell, screaming, and the line wavered. But Belisarius did not move. His calm was unnerving, almost divine. Then he raised his hand. From the far right, 300 Hunnic riders burst from hiding, not to charge, but to ride parallel to the Persian flank, loosing arrows at full gallop. Their audacity enraged Perozes. He sent 3,000 elite cavalry to crush them. The trap began to close. The Huns feigned retreat, drawing the Persians in a wild chase, straight past the angled trench. Hidden inside were 1,000 Gothic mercenaries, silent as statues. When the Persians thundered past, the Goths rose and struck like ghosts. Steel met flesh. The Huns wheeled around and rained arrows into the chaos. In 15 minutes, 3,000 of Persia's finest lay dead. Peroz's pride turned to fury. He unleashed his final weapon, 10,000 immortals, the elite of the Sassanid Empire. Their charge was a storm made of iron, a single unstoppable wall. To the Romans in the center, it was not an army approaching, but an avalanche. The ground quaked beneath them. And yet, when the immortals reached the open gap, the earth betrayed them. They plunged into the corridor Belisarius had prepared, believing they had broken through. Then came the signal. From both sides, the trenches erupted with Roman soldiers rising from the dust like spirits of vengeance. Javelins, stones, and arrows fell in waves. Horses crashed, armor crumpled. The immortals, crushed against one another, became their own tomb. The mightiest cavalry in the world was trapped in a pit, slaughtered not by numbers, but by intellect. From his hill, Perozes watched in horror. The proud general who had mocked the child's trench now saw his invincible guard buried within it. The ditch he scorned had become his empire's grave. Belisarius gave one final command. The Roman infantry advanced across the field, shield walls closing like jaws, while his cavalry struck from both flanks. The Persian army broke. What had begun as an invasion ended as a rout. 50,000 men fled into the desert, leaving behind banners, weapons, and dreams of glory. The Battle of Dara was over. In the dust and silence that followed, the young general who had been sent merely to survive had done the unthinkable. He had turned the earth itself into a weapon, and with it, restored the honor of Rome. At 25, the inexperienced soldier who had turned the dust of Dara into a weapon had done the impossible. He had not merely defeated Perozes, he had humiliated him. With half the enemy's numbers, Belisarius had shattered the pride of Persia. He had not relied on walls or brute strength, but on wit, on the earth itself, on psychology, and on his enemy's arrogance. By dusk, the plain was silent again. The trench that had saved Rome was now a grave. More than 8,000 Persians, most of them immortals, lay still within that narrow scar in the ground. The survivors fled into the desert, hunted relentlessly by Hunnic cavalry. Roman losses were astonishingly few. Dara was more than a victory, it was a resurrection. It was Rome whispering to the world, "I still live," and it was the birth of a legend. Yet for Belisarius, it was only the beginning. The triumph that made him a hero also made him a threat. When the news reached Constantinople, it struck the capital like a bolt of lightning. For decades, the city had known only shame, defeat, corruption, and borders collapsing under barbarian pressure. Now suddenly, the impossible had happened. Rome had triumphed in the east. The city erupted. Crowds filled the streets, chanting the name of Belisarius. His face was painted on tavern walls. His name echoed through the hippodrome. Overnight, a young commander became the savior of Rome. But 800 kilometers away, in the marble corridors of the great palace, the air was colder. Emperor Justinian, a man of iron intellect and fragile trust, received the news with mixed emotions. He was a dreamer determined to rebuild the empire of Augustus, yet also a paranoid who saw conspirators in every shadow. To him, a general loved by the people was not an asset. It was an existential danger. And beside him stood Empress Theodora, once the daughter of a circus bearkeeper, a street performer turned empress. She was sharper than her husband, quicker, and infinitely more ruthless. To Theodora, Belisarius was not a hero. He was a tool, and tools that grow too sharp are soon broken. Whispers began to spread through the palace like poison. Look, they said at the banquets. The Persians underestimated the terrain. He fights like a barbarian. Those Huns of his, that's not Roman strategy. The boy believes himself another Caesar. Jealousy and fear, the two weapons no army can resist, began to gnaw at his name. Across the desert, the Sassanid court seethed. The king of kings, Cavid, stripped Peroses of every title and honor. The annihilation of the immortals was not merely a defeat, it was a wound to Persian pride that could only be healed by vengeance. In the spring of 531, a new Persian force under General Azarethes crossed the frontier. But this time they did not march toward Dara. They avoided Belisarius entirely and slipped through the desert into Roman Syria, the empire's economic heart. They came not to conquer, but to plunder, to burn, to leave ruin in their wake. When word reached Constantinople, Justinian's joy turned to fury. The victory of Dara was forgotten in an instant. The emperor demanded answers. Where was his star general now? Belisarius was ordered to intercept the invaders, but the man who had once been trusted with the fate of empires now found himself distrusted by his own court. His army was smaller, his supplies cut short, and, worst of all, his authority diluted. The emperor sent advisors, men like Hermogenes, whose real task was not to help, but to ensure Belisarius did not shine too brightly again. The campaign became a nightmare. Azarethes was swift. His cavalry lived in the saddle. Belisarius gave chase across the Syrian desert under a pitiless sun that baked men inside their armor. Exhaustion gnawed at the Roman ranks. At last, near the Euphrates River, by the town of Callinicum, the Persians were cornered, trapped with their backs to the water. It was the eve of Easter. Victory was certain if Belisarius waited. His men were spent, dehydrated, barely able to lift their shields. Every instinct told him to rest, to blockade, to let the Persians surrender or starve. But the other officers, the emperor's spies, smelled glory. "Why delay?" they murmured. "They are trapped. Attack now." The murmurs became shouts. Some accused him of cowardice. A soldier, maddened by thirst, spat at his name. The hero of Dara has lost his nerve. Discipline began to unravel. The commanders defied his authority. "Fight," they demanded, "or we will take command ourselves." Belisarius was trapped, not by the Persians, but by his own army. Pride, fear, and pressure crushed the voice of reason. Against his instincts, he gave the order to attack. The result was catastrophe. The Romans advanced not as an army, but as a mob, half dead from heat and thirst, driven by anger more than discipline. Their armor turned to ovens under the Syrian sun. The Persians, fresh and ready, waited behind their shield walls. The collision was not a clash, but a sigh, the sound of exhaustion meeting inevitability. The Roman line faltered at once. Worse still, Belisarius had made a fatal deployment. On his right flank, beside the Euphrates, he had placed his Arab allies, the Ghassanids, brave men, but light cavalry, unsuited to withstand a heavy charge. Azarethes saw the weakness immediately. He sent his elite cataphracts, the new immortals, to strike there with full force. The Ghassanids took one look at the oncoming avalanche of steel and chose survival over honor. They fled. The right flank dissolved in seconds. For the Roman infantry, it was a death sentence. Now attacked from front and rear, they were trapped in a storm of arrows and lances. Formation disintegrated. Panic replaced courage. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Those who could fled toward the river, throwing away their shields and weapons. Weighted by armor, many drowned in the muddy current. The army that had once stood unbroken at Dara was now collapsing in chaos. And then, at the heart of that ruin, Belisarius became something else, not the tactician, but the warrior. Seeing his men butchered, knowing his reputation was finished and his emperor would surely destroy him, he found one last purpose: to save whoever could still be saved. He gathered his guards, the airily, veterans of Dara, and formed a desperate circle by the riverbank, shields locked, facing death together. There, surrounded on all sides, Belisarius dismounted and took his place on the front line. For hours, the small knot of Romans fought like doomed lions, refusing to yield. Persian charges broke again and again against that final ring of defiance. As the sun fell, the bloodied survivors still stood. Azarethes, unwilling to waste more lives, finally called off the assault. When night came, Belisarius gathered what little remained of his force. Under cover of darkness, he ferried his wounded across the Euphrates in small fishing boats. The savior of Dara now crossed the river not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. He had lost his army, his honor, and soon he feared his life. The road back to Constantinople was longer than 1,000 campaigns. Each step felt heavier than defeat itself. The hero who once rode through victory now entered the capital covered in dust and silence. No crowds waited, no songs were sung, only the cold stare of palace guards and the still waters of the Bosporus. He was summoned to the palace at once. The throne room was colder than any battlefield. Justinian sat in silence, his face a mask of frozen rage. Theodora watched with dark, calculating eyes, not angry, but thoughtful, as if measuring the value of a broken man. Around them stood the courtiers and generals who had betrayed him, their voices honeyed with lies. They spoke of Belisarius's hesitation, of panic, of cowardice, claiming he had hidden behind his guards while they, the brave officers, had fought to save the army. Belisarius stood alone on the mosaic floor. The ground that had once saved him at Dara would now consume him in silence. The emperor's voice thundered. What have you to say in your defense? What could he say? That his officers, the emperor's own men, had disobeyed him? That his soldiers had mutinied? To say so was to accuse Justinian himself. And so, the hero bowed his head. Callinicum was not a defeat of arms. It was a political assassination. Belisarius knelt, offering no excuse. Only surrender. The silence was unbearable. Justinian rose, trembling with fury, ready to strip his general of rank, fortune, and perhaps life itself. And then Theodora raised her hand. A single gesture stopped the emperor of the world. She leaned forward, her emerald-ringed fingers glinting in the lamplight, and spoke softly, almost kindly. Her gaze never left Belisarius. She saw what her husband, blinded by rage, could not, that a victorious Belisarius was a rival, but a disgraced Belisarius, a fallen lion, was a weapon. A lion whose claws had been torn out, yet who still remembered how to hunt. And such a creature, broken yet loyal, would serve them better than any general alive. They stripped him of command and laid his honors in the dust. They humiliated him in public, recalled him from the east, and, curiously, spared his life. Forgiveness, in that court, was a cruelty harsher than death. Flavius Belisarius became a specter within the great palace. Visible, useless, forced to watch while the men who had betrayed him at Callinicum were lauded and rewarded. A year passed in whispering corridors and pitying glances. The greatest military mind Rome yet produced wandered marble halls like an unpaid courtier. Yet fate had not finished with him. The next great trial would not come from a Persian king or an emperor's suspicion, but from the city itself, the roaring, color-streaked heart of Constantinople, the Hippodrome. Here the populace lived by faction and fury, under banners of blue and green that meant more than politics. They meant identity, violence, and ritual hatred. In January of 532, a small administration blunder lit a fuse. 2 condemned men, one blue, one green, escaped the execution platform. The crowd seized them, hid them in a church, and in those ragged days the factions ceased to quarrel only with one another. They turned their hatred upon the imperial household, upon Justinian and his magistrates. When the games opened, the shouting that should have been for horses hardened into a chant. blue and green, for once, took the same dreadful word into their mouths. Nika, not a cry for sport, but a cry of rebellion. In an hour, the city had become an inferno. Prisons were smashed open, palaces sacked. The great church, Hagia Sophia, nearly fell to flames. For 5 days, the capital was in the hands of anarchy. The Senate, glad of any opportunity to unseat Justinian, proclaimed a new emperor. The palace, it seemed, would fall. The imperial counselors read the maps and found no escape worth the name. Justinian's face went pale. His generals were scattered on distant fronts. In the throne room, the plan to flee was already being readied. Boats, gold, abdication, when Theodora rose. The woman who had come from the circus to where the purple spoke in a voice cold as steel. Flight, she declared, would be a stain a sovereign could never wash away. Purple is a noble shroud, she said, an answer that broke the heads bowed before panic. If the emperor were to die, he would die there and take his city with him rather than survive to be mocked. Justinian's eyes searched the shadowed hall for allies. There, framed against the dark, sat the palace's apparent ghost, Belisarius. He had no command, only the handful of veterans who refused to abandon him, his loyal airily, a few hundred swords hardened in the deserts and at Dara. Alongside him stood Mundus and his barbarian cohort. Perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 men in all, an army of mercenaries against a sea of 100,000 rioters in the Hippodrome. The odds were obscene. The order that followed was uglier still. March on the Hippodrome. If the city will crown a usurper, the palace would crown death. Belisarius accepted without hesitation, not from love of Justinian, not purely from loyalty, but because the calculus of survival and power was now simple. A disgraced hero could be remade as a tool. A tool, if kept sharp, could be wielded without pity. He gathered his men. Mundus gathered his. They moved like a blade in the night beneath a capital already half in ashes. The Hippodrome that day was a boiling vat of triumph and wine and slaughter. Apicius, an emperor chosen by mob and senator alike, sat enthroned amid cheers. The crowd did not hear the sound of footfalls against marble until they broken upon them, a thunderous charge of iron and leather that stunned the mass for a single heartbeat. Belisarius split his force. Mundus took one gate, Belisarius another. For a moment, the vast roar went suddenly, terrifyingly silent. 100,000 heads turned and saw the fallen general step into the open with 100 grim barbarians behind him. What followed was not a pitched battle, but an execution performed with grim discipline. The Aerili and the Bucellarii, mercenary infantry who answered only to their paymaster, closed like shears. They advanced with cold efficiency, shield by shield, stabbing, cutting, pushing the mob into a narrowing bowl from which there was no escape. Mundus' men slammed the exits, and marble became a slaughterhouse. The killing was methodical, almost bureaucratic, not the heat of battlefield frenzy, but the steady work of men ordered to obliterate a crowd. Surrender was meaningless. The imperial will demanded the city be quelled. Estimates swirl, thousands, tens of thousands. Ancient chroniclers argued over numbers with the fervor of survivors counting ghosts. Modern historians still debate whether 30, 40, or 50,000 perished. Whatever the tally, the Hippodrome's white marble was stained red. The rebellion called Nika died in a heap of bodies and broken banners. When dawn broke over Constantinople, the city smoldered and the throne had been saved. Belisarius emerged from that slaughter drenched in other people's blood. He had done what was necessary for Justinian to remain emperor. He had destroyed the public that had once adored him. In that grotesque bargain, his popularity died. No longer the beloved savior of Dara, no longer the failed commander of Callinicum, he had become something else, Theodora's instrument, the palace's blunt sword. He had purchased his life and favor with the blood of his fellow citizens. With the capital pacified and the Persian threat held at bay, Justinian's grand designs could resume. Africa, the reconquest of former Roman provinces, the rebuilding of empire. There was, in the end, only one man he would trust to lead those costly enterprises, one brilliant enough to win and compromised enough that none would dare crown him if he should fail. Belisarius, butcher of the hippodrome, was that man.